Welcome to the Battlefield Show. I'm your host, Sage Goodwin, and as always, I'm joined by Sammy Boy. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. How are you?
Doing fantastic. We're here. We're going to be talking about all things specialist, our thoughts, both good and bad. Probably going to be a little heavier on the bad because we have some extended thoughts. We've had a little more time to think about the whole specialist system, but we're also going to talk about some of the ways that it is good. So, won't be all negative today. So let's hop right in and talk about some specialists. Okay, I think this is the probably the hottest talking point in all of Battlefield right now, at least since they were fully announced. We got to play with them in the beta for sure. Let's jump right in. Let's talk about first off our initial reactions to it, and then when we actually got our hands on it, how we got to play with. And there's some multiple different things there, but I know for myself personally, I was very interested to see how they would do the specialist. I think they were, at least when they first said they were going to do the specialist, like, okay, I don't understand why you're doing this, but it could introduce a good side of the gameplay. Well, we'll see how it goes. What about you?
Yeah, I was actually really excited. Like, it's a weird contrast from when they revealed it to when we played the beta, because I was like really one of the people that was kind of all for it, and I was like really excited by it. I thought on paper a lot of the stuff that they were talking about in terms of just opening the classes up and kind of giving us a bit more freedom, it all sounded really good. And then once we got our hands on it, I wasn't as big of a fan. Mostly just, I think it doesn't need too much of a change. I just don't really like the fact that it's so open. Like, it's almost like they've opened it a bit too much. So I'm kind of the same as you, where I was actually really excited early on. And then pretty much from the beta, that was really my only like proper disappointment in terms of what we played in the beta. Like, there was obviously all the bugs and stuff like that, but that's the type of stuff that can be fixed. Whereas I kind of could tell the specialist system, unless they were going to do something drastic, I knew it wouldn't really change much. So, yeah, it's been a weird change of heart, really, from when they revealed it to now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world either. Like, I think it'll grow on me. So I'm going to try to, I guess, hold off my full judgment on the system until, you know, a few months played, so that we can, because there's also more specialists that we haven't played yet and stuff. So, yeah, I'm not fully set on my opinion, but at least like my initial thoughts on it, I'm definitely not too fond of it, I would say that.
Yeah, I mean, when you compare it to the class system in and of itself, like the class system versus the specialist, the class system is tried and true. It's what everyone expects when they come to a Battlefield game. And I think this is the key thing with Battlefield 2042, with the controversies that they've had, probably historically with the games too. They've had this happen a few times. With Battlefront 2015, they removed the class system with that, and everyone freaked out. And then ultimately in Battlefront 2, they brought back the class system and said, okay, guys, yeah, we understand this. So it seems like every time they try to adjust something that is a core experience that people expect when they play either a Battlefront or a Battlefield game, it does go poorly. Ultimately, I think it's a big part of what people expect for Battlefield. So I think that's one of the key reasons. And I wouldn't say like it's necessarily negative in terms of people's adverse reaction to it, because I've seen a lot of people who are like hardcore Battlefield shills, pretty much, like whatever they do. Again, it's all kind of tongue in cheek when I say that. But people who are like, when DICE says something, they're like always on the good side of things.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, oh, all these people crapping on the specialist system. Well, they just don't like change. It's like, no, I think people really enjoy change. I think there's steps too far, and it may be what people expect in a Battlefield game. Like another game entirely could do specialists very well. But I think for me, the core thing that really I struggle with the specialist system is they don't specialize enough almost. Like they have these core things, but they really reserved a lot of it. Like even the thing that made Maria Falk really impactful was the revive system. Like, were you able to revive from a distance? Like, that's something extremely powerful, like so much so that they adjusted and removed it. But I think if they added stuff like that to all of the other specialists, I think it'd be a lot more interesting of a game experience than, oh, well, Maria Falk's kind of like the health person, but she's also not. Also, this other person is kind of like Maria Falk, but also not, but for like ammo. And this other person is a shield person, but not like this other shield person, but they're kind of like the other shield person. Like there's too much of a crossover, I feel. And I don't think there's going to be enough of a reason to play anything other than probably 3 of the 10 specialists. I think that's kind of like where the uniqueness lies, is there's going to be 3 very core ones where their abilities really stand out. And then the rest of them are going to be like, oh, well, don't really play those guys.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. Like, I remember saying that. I reckon we both sort of said that in our first like thoughts on the beta, was that the term specialist makes you think that they specialize in something when they really don't. Like, there's no one really, unless maybe, some of the new specialists are a lot better than the ones we played or something, but there's really no actual reason to play any of them over the rest. Like, it's you can kind of just pick whatever loadout you want, and at the end of the day, your specialist almost feels like it doesn't matter that much. Like, it's not going to drastically change, other than maybe the movement related ones, like McKay and Sundance. I think that they'll be you'll be able to get around the map a lot faster and stuff with those guys. But other than them, I just don't feel like there is actually that much of a reason to go like, oh, I need to play as Falk because I need to heal teammates, when you can just equip a medic crate and you can still revive your squad mates anyway. So it just feels like the actual specialist sort of side of it, then they're just not specialists of anything, and that's kind of my issue with it, is that I think like the medic class specialized in being a medic more than Maria Falk does, you know what I mean? So I think on paper, I think it was a really good idea, and I think with some tweaks it can still be turned around to be really good, but I think the initial like execution just isn't probably where most people want it to be, I guess.
The way that they have the game mode set up, All Out Warfare, it doesn't really lend itself to that level of like specialty. Like when you have that large of a scope, there's only going to be certain specialists that you're going to want to play. Now, it's just something completely different when you look at something like Hazard Zone, which we talked about last episode, and basically you blew my mind in terms of how we perceive these specialists depending on where we are. Like in Hazard Zone, these specialists, I think there's 2 sides of this. I have 2 theories here. The specialists were really made for Hazard Zone, and that was kind of what they were looking at, whether or not they really kind of crystallized what that was going to be ultimately. And then I think the other part is almost kind of like a tinfoil hat theory, but not quite, because it does have a little bit of a base there. Is I wonder if the reason we have specialists is because of it was almost like the storytelling influenced it more than the actual gameplay side of things. Like, they really wanted to play around with this introduction of a new type of storytelling in the game. Yeah. And that really inspired the mechanics versus what they ultimately wanted to do. But again, when I say that too, depending on how far along they got with the specialist system, usually the mechanics are done way sooner than the story is.
Yeah, I think that at least like the outline of the story, though, they would have, because that's generally like one of the first things they work on with like the setting and stuff. And I don't think the actual full story would have been done, but I think they would have had an idea that like they would have had the whole like notepad idea where it's like there's no real countries left and stuff like that. So that little theory is actually, I genuinely think that is a big part of it. I think both the things you just said, the fact that they probably were built a lot for Hazard Zone, because I actually, as much as I'm not a fan of them in like All Out Warfare, I love them for Hazard Zone. Like that is gonna be such an awesome dynamic to have that type of game with like the sort of like Apex added in there where it's like a hero shooter. So I think it's great for that, and I think that that was one of the things they wanted to do. And then they probably thought, oh, well, like we can try and work these into multiplayer as well. because it would, like, to be fair, it would be almost a little bit weird if they had regular classes, but then you go and play Hazard Zone and there's 10 specialists. Like, I feel like that would actually be a bit like weird and kind of jarring. So I think the combination of Hazard Zone and like the story, this is their storytelling. Like, each character kind of has their little lore behind them, and that's essentially the campaign. Like, there is no actual story.
Yeah.
So I think both of those are pretty realistic, like, theories that those two, even combined with just them simply wanting to open up the classes, this is a way to do that. I think all of those things combined probably are like why they've added this in, and I don't think they did it to just go like, oh, we need to get rid of the class system, but they maybe just thought there was a new sort of different way of doing things, and they've shown in the past that they do like to change things up like that. Not all of them go as planned, I guess, but yeah, it's a weird. It's I kind of wish that they would give us like a whole Battlefield briefing on like why they, their sort of plan of what they thought at the start and why they wanted to implement this stuff, because it's just a weird thing to think of. Like, there's so many little theories of why they did this. A lot of people just say, oh, it's just for microtransactions, like they just want to make money and stuff, and that's probably part of it too, to be fair. So yeah, it's very, very odd to just not know why they've sort of gone so far from what we're used to, really.
Yeah, it's such a strange thing to see. I mean, like you said, I'd love to see an inner working or even just like a description of why they implemented the specialists, because they really hopped around the whole thing in the most recent Battlefield briefing where they were talking about the specialists. Like, they didn't really mention it otherwise. Okay, guys, well, the specialist system is good, and if you don't like it, it's because not all of the specialists are in the game, which I think is a fair thing. You should definitely reserve some of your judgment once you have the full cards in play. But I think part of the reason that they're doing that is because they knew it was going to be controversial, and they knew they were going to have to make drastic changes to how it was going to be played, that they said, okay, we're going to release the first 5, and then we're going to have the next 5 afterwards. So as we get that beta experience and that beta feedback, we can adjust them as a whole. I hope so. I hope that's the case, because it does need some work, and they either need to make it a lot less specialized, in it, which kind of defeats the purpose of them being called specialists, or they need to make it a little bit more specialized across the board to make it more intriguing for these people, for us as players to play these characters that they did put a whole lot of time and effort in developing the storyline, developing the play styles, developing the designs. Like, there's so many different characters, and there's so many different the diversity in these characters is incredible in terms of where they are in the world, where they're from. They're like even like gender identity. Sundance was confirmed to be non-binary, which is great to see in current day and age where we have a lacking of those kinds of characters in our gaming. So I think there's so many different levels to the specialist system, but it's almost like you still could have done it with a class system too. So like, where is that key thing that really draws it to defend the decision to go towards specialists versus classes?
Yeah, and that's a good point that you make, that like they really could have done this with a class system and just had it so that you can essentially choose your character, and that character doesn't have any special gadgets. It's just like you pick to play as the medic class, and then your skin is, say, Maria Falk, for example, and it doesn't change any actual abilities or whatever. And then if they wanted to do that, they could still have, in Hazard Zone, they still have those abilities or something. So it's kind of just a confusing thing that they've done, really. And like, on paper, when they first said it, I was like, oh, this is awesome. So I can see why they've kind of stuck with it, because I think when they would have been making all these decisions and stuff, it sounded great to me. I was really like, oh, this sounds really good. It's a nice sort of change that's not too far from what we're used to, but I think upon actually playing it, it does feel quite a bit different. And so I do just hope that they can change things up. I hope that they don't sort of, I guess, stay too stubborn to where they're like, nah, this is how it is. We're just keeping it like this. I hope that they are open to, making those small changes, like the locking certain stuff behind each class or whatever. That type of stuff doesn't take away, I guess, from the actual specialists. Like, they're still there and they've still got their gadgets and stuff, but it just kind of balances it to where essentially where we want it and where they want it. That is almost the middle, like the middle ground. So I just hope that they're at least open to it, and I'm sure that because they've kind of stuck to their guns now. Like they talked about it a little bit in that briefing the other week. I hope that they're kind of thinking like, okay, we're going to stick to our guns now because we know that there's 10 more specialists, and once everyone gets all their skins and stuff, that might get away from that. So the issue, but like half the issue is people just saying they don't like shooting someone that looks the same as them, for example, because it's just like confusing. So all of these things, they might be thinking, okay, let's just give it a few months and see what people think. If it comes to people still not liking it, maybe then they change it. But I just hope that they keep an open mind about it, really, because I don't think it's too far from where it needs to be. I don't think it's like, I'm sort of not in that camp of like, oh, let's just scrap the specialist and go back to classes, because I'm fine if they have the specialist. I think they can just kind of improve on them a little bit to where they fit better within the Battlefield franchise, I guess.
Yeah. It's it's a shame. Like, everything in this game is so great, and like I think if they had stuck with their guns in terms of like what a Battlefield experience is like in terms of like looking at the feedback of why Battlefield was not as successful as maybe it should have been or could have been, and kind of stuck with the core thing of Battlefield instead of playing around with what people expect, it's almost kind of like, I don't think it'll be to this level, but it is one of the controversies. There always seems to be a controversy with one of DICE's games at launch, and so far I think it may be the specialist system. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully people do get used to it, but I think it's like, in terms of, there was the loot bot controversy, there was the lack of classes in Battlefront 2015, there was Battlefield 5 just had so many different levels of controversies that it wasn't even crazy, and then they all blamed it on the lack of marketing, and that's definitely a part of it. There's so many of these things that they put into the game that I think they could have avoided if they did kind of stick with the core and then worked inside of those boundaries. But because I totally could see the specialist system, even if it is like it's class based, so these characters, like, you do get to choose these different characters, and they may have different abilities, they may have like slightly different specializations, but they have access to kind of similar abilities. Like I could say like Maria Falk, and I think it's
Engel, is that the one you talk about?
Yeah. Engel. I think those two could have been basically put into kind of like the medics class, and it's depending on which kind of medic you'd like to play. Yeah. And then you have the decision there, because they could have said, okay, yeah, we're going to have specialists, but we're also going to have it in the wrapper of a class, and kind of you are limited in terms of what weapons you can choose, but it is a little bit wider than the previous games have been. Yeah. I think that could have been cool. Because like there's so many different levels of balancing that they're now having to do for themselves, because you can have a self-healing sniper, or a sniper that automatically regens their ammo. I think that's a good point, is that there's so many different like angles that they need to balance now. It's not just like, oh, the assault class is a bit strong, let's nerf certain things. It's like, now for something that is really strong, there's probably like 15 things that can make it strong, and it's not really, they can't just balance, like, for example, the sniper that can heal themselves, they can't really just balance that straight away, because then they can, if their health crate gets nerfed a little bit, they'll just switch to ammo, and then, like you said, they're now
a sniper that has unlimited ammo. So it's like there's just so many little elements that it's probably individually a lot easier to balance those small things, but I think there's going to be a lot of like almost like loopholes that people find where it's like, oh, well, they nerfed, sniping, but you can use this other attachment or you can use this different gadget and it helps you. It kind of like makes up for that nerf, I guess. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think that's really the main worry. Like, yeah, the main issue for me now is just the balancing side of things. I'm as much as I'm not a fan of the specialist, I'm kind of open to it. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, this is stupid. I'm just never going to play with specialists. I'll just play Portal. Like, I'm sure I'll, play the specialist more than enough. But like, if they're not balanced, that's going to be a genuine issue. And I think that's the main thing for me is that I'm open to playing how they want it to be, but if it's unbalanced, for example, with Jisoo, like a lot of people are complaining about her, essentially her wall hack. Like that's the type of stuff that they're trying to make everyone be able to play how they want. But I can already see if they don't nerf her within a month, within 2 weeks of launch, everyone will be playing as Jisoo with an SMG or an AR, and everyone will be, as much as they're trying to make everyone unique and everyone can play how they want, everyone will choose the same thing. So it's kind of defeating the purpose of what they're actually trying to do. And I think that's where the issue lies for me, is just that if you're going to make it, they almost seem like they're trying to make it like, we want you to be able to use whatever you want and just have fun however you want, which is great, but that means that essentially every single thing in the game needs to be perfectly balanced, because if there's something that's better, I might want to play as Sundance, but if Jisoo is way better, I'll be playing as Jisoo. Like, that's just how gaming works. If you want to have a good game and there's one character that's just way better, like, everyone's going to use that character. We've already seen it with McKay, and he doesn't like... The grapple hook's not even that good. It just helps you get to spots.
Yeah.
Like, her wall hack, for example, is way better than a grapple hook. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they balance it. That's really my main issue now with the specialist. I've kind of come to terms that, like, yeah, that's how it's going to be, and I'm not, as much as I'm not the biggest fan of it, I'm, I guess, open to it, and, sometimes change can be good. We might in 6 months go, oh, damn, the specialist system's really good. We just needed to get used to it. So I'm fine with trying it, but yeah, the balancing is the part that has me more worried than whether I like it or not, really.
Yeah. So I'm gonna play devil's advocate here, real quick. Just I'm 100% agree with you, and I think it needs to be balanced, and they've definitely given themselves so much more work than if they had just done the class system, because as we've said before, you've got the 4 classes to balance against each other versus now you have 10 specialists that have access to all of the weapons and have access to varying different levels. You also have to balance them in Hazard Zone. You have to balance them in All-Out Warfare. And like, there's so many different things you have to keep in mind now. It's not just, oh, you have to balance the classes individually and then versus them each other. Like, you have to... Basically, it's opening up the floodgates to where you have to balance a McKay with a sniper and a McKay with an SMG. Like, you have to balance all these characters in so many different ways than you previously would. But in terms of like playing devil's advocate, why is it such a bad thing that everyone plays the same character?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's more just like not what they want. At the end of the day, I think it's no different than COD. If everyone's like, doesn't matter what skin you're wearing in COD, everyone's the same essentially, other than your loadout. So yeah, it's really not the end of the world if it does go that way, but it's more just against what they kind of made the specialist system for. Because I remember they were saying initially that like they felt like they wanted to open up the weapons specifically because people were picking the medic class not to play as a medic, but to use the SMGs, for example. Yeah. So you had so many people playing medic, and then it kind of just throws off the balance of like what they actually want from the class system. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a bad thing. It's more just like we're not getting the full extent of the game, because ideally if there's 10 specialists, there's 128 per lobby. So there should be 12 of each specialist on average, for example.
Yeah.
And that would be like the ideal Battlefield game, is that it's like a really even spread and there's a bunch of different characters using their abilities and it all like kind of works in tandem. But if, let's just say it is literally 64 Jisoo's versus 64 Jisoo's, like that will just be absolute chaos because everyone who's close to anyone will be able to find anyone, and it's just going to be essentially like everyone in the game has a wall hack. So it's mostly, again, to do with like that then changes the flow of the game. Like the actual way that 2042 is played is going to be different to how they actually intended it to be. So
yeah, it also makes it less of a Battlefield game and more of like a completely different game.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a thing, is it like, I think depending on who it is, it might lead to, you know, less people playing the objective because you can just run around and wall hack and get kills. So people, you know, we kind of lose that, I guess, PTFO feeling of Battlefield, where there's a lot of times when, you know, your team really does, everyone's trying to win, and those are the fun games rather than the games where everyone's just trying to get kills. And then, like, say in, like, imagine a mode like Rush or Breakthrough, where there's like everyone's in the same area and everyone has a wall hack. That'll just be completely ridiculous. So I think they definitely need to try their best to like stop that meta build from happening where there's just one thing that everyone uses, and it's going to be hard to do. And I have no doubt that it will. Like, there always is a meta. Like, there's always going to be something that people generally use more than other stuff. But as long as they can just make it as balanced as possible to where you don't feel like you have to, more than, you know, if you want to play as Jisoo, that's fine. But if you feel like it's like, oh, I want to play as this character, but if I'm not playing as Jisoo, like, I'm not going to win, then that's the part where the issue comes in, I think.
I think the thing that's almost even a bigger problem than everyone playing them the same for the similar abilities is the way that they have the identifying in terms of making it to where everyone looks different is so poorly implemented. Even with kind of like an enemy symbol above their heads, you're not going to be looking for that first off. You're going to be a human and look at what they look like first, and it's just not going to work out. I think that's the bigger problem, is they still need to really change up how they are going to separate each of the characters depending on what side of the fight they're on.
I wish that, like, this is my little theory from the get-go, that it doesn't really make sense with the story because the whole point of, like, the no-pats is that they're freedom fighters. They're not really on any team. They're just, like, doing what they want for their nations or whatever. But it would have been great to have, like, 10 specialists, but each specialist is kind of two people. So you have, say, like, you have McKay, for example, who might be on the US side. He's from Canada, so he's fighting for the US. But then with the exact same set of abilities, you have, like, a Russian guy who's, you know, his name's Vladimir, for example, and he's just the Russian McKay, and they're essentially the same character. But one, you know that one is going to be fighting. So if you're on the American team, you know that if you see Vladimir, like, that's an enemy. And the same way, the other way, like, if you see McKay, you know that he's got the same abilities as you, but he's not your teammate. That would have been a way that they could essentially have 20 characters, which it's a lot more work. Obviously, they need to get 10 more character models and 10 more voice actors to come in. But essentially having the same specialists, other than... Because, like, if you had, say, 20 actual specialists to where it's like they're all different and they're on different teams, then that causes a balancing issue like we had with Battlefront 2, where, like, you have the same amount of heroes on each team, but they're not the same, and one team kind of gets better. But if you have, I guess, 10 characters on each team and they all have the same, like, you know, abilities and stuff as the other guy, then that could be a way to balance it and get rid of that identifying issue with, you know, is that Falk on my team or the other team? Have it so that Falk fights for the Russians, and then there's like an Aussie bloody medic who, if you see that person, then you know, okay, they're fighting for the US team, for example. So that's one way they could have done it, but obviously it's way more work, and it also
Yeah.
wouldn't really suit the story. So I'm not sure that would really work, but I think
I
that
mean,
would definitely help a
it
bit.
could fit in the story frame that they have there, because like you said, it's all about these no-pats who have been displaced, and there's definitely going to be more than just 10. So I think
Yeah.
it would make sense that there would be similar people depending on what side you're on.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at something like Apex in terms of how they run their stories, they're separate from the game to the running story, because they aren't like, oh, what happens in the game in terms of like, or even in between storylines. Honestly, like from the storyline trailers, they have characters that will murder each other, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
like, yes, they're dead, but it's also in the broader story. It's just a way to explain how these characters are impacted in the whole of things.
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, if they do have an Australian Maria Falk and then they have a Russian one, like, I think that's perfectly fine. I think if they have like these two different, even if it's the same name, honestly, if it's the same name but they have like different character models,
Yeah.
I think that works. Like, there could be a really fun idea, like, depending on what side you're on, if they wanted to go even further, like, you could choose the gender, you can choose I don't think that would be as impactful as they have it now, but like, you could have these completely different looking models in this game depending on what side you're on. I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah. I think now that you say it, it does, like, I think that little theory of having kind of 2 people per specialist would really, I think that would fit into the story when you think of it, because it's almost weirder that McKay is fighting for the US and the Russian side. Like, it kind of doesn't make sense. So it would actually, I feel like that would be more realistic that in the storyline, McKay is from Canada, and because, Canada's right next to America, he wanted to fight for the US and he wanted to help them out. So he's the US specialist, and then, they could have a Russian version of him who obviously wants to fight for the Russians, and that would actually fit the story. And then I guess it's weird that they have the same abilities in a way. You could go like, oh, that's unrealistic that they'd have the same ability, but I think that's just for balancing to have, 2 characters that are essentially identical other than their skin and their voice actor. I think that it would, that way of going about it would have been better. Again, it would have been so much work. So it's like, it's easy to say, oh, just do that, but it's obviously not as simple as that. But
yeah, but it would definitely be more work than completely changing up the whole specialist system. Like, if they are faced with that decision of, and the main problem with specialists, once we get into the full game, once we have the whole of them, and if they do get balanced, or they are balanced, if that's the main complaint ultimately with the specialists, it's way easier to add variance in their looks, depending on what side you are on, than completely reworking the specialist system to a class system.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, it's, at the end of the day, it really would just be like making a new skin, and think about how many skins they're going to have in the game and how many they're going to add each battle pass. So it's really just like adding a new skin, and then obviously the voice acting and stuff would be a pain for them to have to get 10 extra voice actors to come in. But I think that would be one way to fix it. Again, it wouldn't really fix the issue of it not feeling like a class system like the previous games, but in terms of the sort of identifying issues, I think that would be really, or something like that anyway, that would be a fix that just stops it from being like, for example, like we were saying, imagine if there is Jisoo on both teams, like 64 players on each team. The other thing in that is that, like, you're going to see Jisoo every 5 seconds, and you're not going to know immediately if that's a teammate or an enemy. At least if they had Jisoo and then, like I said, like an Aussie version of Jisoo, and it's the same person, at least one team you're going to know is the Aussie character. And if you see that person, you shoot him. So, it's... I'm really not sure how they're going to go about that whole issue of, like, trying to identify who's who, because that is a genuine issue, especially for, like, the hardcore modes. Like, what if you set up a hardcore server? You're not going to know who's who. like and there's friendly fire,
Just
so you
shoot
can't just shoot them and
everyone.
test. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's gonna be very interesting. I think that's almost going to be more interesting to see how they deal with that than the actual specialist system. To me, like the system itself, as much as I'm not a fan of it, I think it can still work, but the identifying thing like that, yeah, that really is a pretty big issue that they didn't really think of, I think.
Yeah. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway with both the UI and some of the design elements of this is there's so many things that, like, if you take a few minutes to just really think about how it is implemented in the game itself versus how it is on your computer screen separated from the gaming experience, they're two different worlds. Yes, you can make an incredibly awesome looking Jisoo skin, but like if you can't identify them from another team, it's not really going to work. And I think that's what happened. And it also happened with the scoreboard system. Like if you are just designing a scoreboard system to be in a screenshot versus how people actually want to play with the scoreboard, you're going to come apart with like completely different ideas of what that looks like and how it's implemented.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's one thing with UI that they always say is that you kind of have to plan out your initial layouts and all that kind of thing, and then you have to just go through and find every single issue you can think of, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how nice anything looks, it has to work. That's the core thing, that it has to work as intended. And that's the issue, is that a lot of these things kind of, you know, the HUD and all that, like this tiny little dot above an enemy, for example, it looks clean because it's not all up in my face showing their whole name, but it doesn't work properly. So I think I would rather it work and not look as good than it looks really nice, but I can't tell if that's a freaking enemy or not. So
exactly,
that's kind of a lot of the issues that I had, was that, yeah, it looks great, it just doesn't really work as it's intended, I guess.
Yeah, and they said that for the full release, they have an implementation in terms of like there's going to be a symbol depending on what team you're on. But again, that's a similar thing with the dot above the head. You're still looking for that versus looking at a difference of, like, you're not going to notice the dot floating above their head or a symbol floating above their head when you run down a hallway and you have to quickly decide, do I fire at this person? Or like there were so many times where I would be firing on my teammate and be like, oh, that's my teammate, and then I'd get shot in the back. Or I would hesitate when they weren't my teammate and then I'd get shot.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that like I am actually pretty used to that with Warzone. I'm like, in that game, obviously just everyone wears whatever skin they want. So I've played so much of that I'm kind of used to that. And even I found myself having so many, I've been like going through and editing videos, and I'll see that many moments in a game where I was shooting at a teammate because I thought it was an enemy. And so if that's happening to me, I'm like used to that, imagine all the people that haven't really played those games and they're just used to Battlefield. Like, it'd be way worse for those guys. So it's a pretty big issue, and I think it's going to be pretty interesting to see how they change that, because I don't think those small things, like they've said, like I think they talked about making your own teammates easier to tell that it's a teammate, which that definitely helps. Like if you're running into a door and there's someone in that hallway, for example, before you actually like open the door, you'll see their name pop up through the wall. Like that kind of thing will help, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to very, very clearly tell who's who, and I don't think that can really be done by the UI. I think it needs to be done through their actual look. And like, even for example in Battlefield 1, you could always tell who was who by like the audio. So if you heard an enemy outside and you could hear them speaking Turkish, for example, and you're on the English team, that's obviously not a teammate. Whereas in this, if you hear a McKay outside, you don't know. Like that could be your teammate or it could be the enemy. So there's just a lot of those little small issues that, I can see why they haven't picked up on a few of those, because they're very hard to actually think about until you actually play the game. But then again, they've been testing it, so you'd think they would have like found that stuff out earlier. But Yeah, it's I can understand why it's slipped past them a little bit, but now that everyone's aware of it, I think that they really need to sort of jump on that pretty early. I think that's really the main issue. Like the specialist system in general is something they need to start like working on pretty heavily now, I think.
Yeah. Once they get kind of a clear launch period and they have kind of how people are playing the game, how it is all implemented in terms of all of the specialists are there, and overall the way the game flows with actual people on the games playing them, it's going to reveal a lot of the issues that have made it past the internal testing. And because people don't play the game how they're supposed to play the game.
Yeah.
They play the game how they play the game.
Yeah, that's the thing that I always, to some extent, cut the devs a bit of slack across any game, because like internally they all kind of know how the game's meant to be played, so they're probably all playing a bit more within the rules, I guess. Whereas anytime you release something to millions of players, like this game will sell, it will have 10 million sales probably by the time it's like the end of November. So when you release a game to that many people, I can understand why there's a lot of these little issues, but as long as they, like, it does seem like they're aware of it, which is good, and I hope that they just continue to like work with us. And really, so far as other than that sort of quiet patch between Exodus and the delay, other than that, I really think the communication for this game has been pretty solid, and they do sound like they're listening a lot. Like they've shown us all the stuff in the briefing last week where it was like all the UI changes that was the stuff that we were really asking for, and they're actually doing it. So I just hope that they keep that up. They're doing a really good job of that, which is a weird thing to say with DICE. Like that's not something I say very lightly, because in the past they've not been that great at it. And yeah, I think they've done, again, other than that, like 6 weeks, which kind of was a pretty long period, so it is a bigger chunk than I'm probably making it out to be. But other than that, it's been really good, and I just hope that they continue to do that. And like when we say, when the whole community is saying this needs to be fixed, I hope that they are actually listening to that and continue to do that throughout launch.
I agree. I am on board with you 100% in terms of like what they've been doing in terms of communicating has been very good, and I've appreciated the level of communication and the level of clarity that they've had. And I just hope they keep it up, and we do get these inner lookings of like, okay, this is what we learned. I'd love to see in the first week or two of the game being out, be like, okay, these are the known issues. These are the things that we're working on right now. These are the things that are on our highest priority. Just kind of involving the community of what they're going through. It's part of just educating the really hardcore fans. Like if you do educate people, yeah, they're going to hold you to it, but they're also going to have better insights to that than someone who has no idea how game development works because you haven't told them how your game development works.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that in a way would kind of give them a bit of leeway to like, okay, we're telling people how this works, and now people kind of understand why this or that takes so long to do, and it would kind of take a bit of pressure off them, hopefully, to, people would actually understand why things take so long, and then they can hopefully get a lot less slack for it and stuff, because I can't imagine that's healthy for the developers to be getting, all the abuse and stuff from those really like toxic fans, and hopefully being a bit more transparent will kind of open the eyes of those guys a bit. And then, yeah, like I think at the end of the day, transparency is just key. Like if everyone kind of knows what's going on, it just works better for everyone. Like everyone just benefits from that. So I just hope that they keep it up, because yeah, other than that period, it's been, especially the last, really since the beta and even a bit before the beta, it's been pretty solid. Like they've really told us a lot of stuff they didn't really need to tell us in that last briefing about those, like the end of round changes and stuff. And that's the type of stuff that we all want to know, like, what improvements are you making? So hopefully they take that same thing with the specialist system and realize that it's not just a small group of people that are complaining. It is a pretty like substantial group in the community that really isn't a fan, and hopefully they can just work with us to make some small changes and find that middle ground.
Exactly. That's all we're looking for, is that middle ground.
Exactly.
But I think with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Battlefield Show. Greatly appreciate all of your support and all of you listening and checking out our channels. You can find both of us on YouTube, Sammy Boy with 3 eyes there, and Uplink Podcast. So make sure that you check out both of our channels there as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This is a big thing that we've been working towards. We've been hyping up this podcast episode for, I think, like 3 weeks now. So it's been great kind of diving deep into something that is multifaceted in its problems. So would love to hear your thoughts and your suggestions and what you love and what you hate about the specialist system and what you're just kind of like, okay, yeah, I'm fine with playing it. Would love to hear that in the comments below or on email, Twitter, all the places. Greatly appreciate that as well. If you do leave a review, we'd greatly appreciate that. You can leave a review wherever you find podcasts. Helps us out a bunch in terms of getting your feedback as well as other people finding the show. And we'd like to thank Ethan Clark for the lovely thumbnail. As always, we'll see you on the battlefield.